Coming to you entirely pre-recorded from the Garage of Solitude here in Whitestone, Queens, I am Mario-Francisco Robles, and this is episode 13 of the Superman on Film podcast. At last, some of you have been waiting for this episode for quite a while. I know I've been gone for a little bit, and truth be told, things aren't so great over here on my end of things. I'm being a little bit of the sad clown lately, where things behind the scenes aren't that wonderful, and perhaps some rather large, interesting changes are coming towards my life very, very soon. But for the purpose of this, since we're talking about something that brings me joy, which is Superman, and we're focusing on hope, which is the core essential ingredient of any great Superman story, let's stay positive and let's talk about one of the beautiful things that has happened since we last spoke. Because you see, I was very inspired by James Gunn's story of Ozu, the dog that he adopted and who would eventually inspire the addition of Krypto to his Superman movie. And his post about the dog really made me realize how much I missed having a dog. My dog Lucy passed away last February, and I almost kind of didn't let myself grieve that or mourn that much because I had to be strong for my family, and I kind of just focused on getting done what had to get done and trying to create some kind of normalcy here in the house. But really, not having the dog after being with her for 13 years, the house felt rather empty, and we were missing something. And that's why I am happy to report that as of a couple weeks ago now, we have a new pooch, and his name is Clark Elliot Robles, but his friends call him Clark L. But yes, so we have added a puppy to the family here, and he's awesome, and we're training him, and there's a lot of work that goes into training a puppy, I'll tell you that much. But it's been a very rewarding process, getting to know him and train him. And it's just, Clark L has officially joined the House of Robles. So that's a happy bit of news. Let's also talk about the fact that we are now only 34 weeks away from James Gunn's Superman. So the countdown continues. We're getting ever closer. And with that in mind, I'm so grateful to have Superman in my life at a time like this. He shows up in weird places and in weird ways. Sometimes it's like I'm going through a bad day, but I'm reading one of the Superman books that inspired the movie, and there's a message in the books, or there's something in the story that actually connects to my present day feelings and things like that. And it's just like Supes tends to show up like a real person in my life. I've always felt like he's a friend, like he's someone who's around for me somehow, even though obviously he's just a fictional story and a dude with a big red cape. But, I've always said that Superman fans we're cut different. The people who love Superman, I always just find tend to have a kinder, softer, more giving nature. If you can understand the story of this superpowered alien and see why it's so magnificently special, that the upbringing he received from his parents turned him into a wonderful, giving, kind, selfless person, instead of the kind of selfish animals that a lot of people around us prove themselves to be over time. If you're able to look at that story of Superman's kindness and hope and ability to push through all the darkest things and still try to be the best possible, it tends to say something about you. And I've shared stories in the past, like the fact that I got the Superman on film handle just by asking for it. In other previous ventures of my life, when I wanted something and someone else had a particular handle or website, if I mentioned, hey, could I have that since I'm actually using it and you aren't? And people would have to, would try to charge me thousands of dollars and hundreds of dollars for this or that. But when it came to this Superman on film thing, I went to the fella who had Superman film on Twitter already. And I said, hey, here's what I'm planning on doing. Would you mind just letting me have the name, since it looks like you just use it as a handle and I want to use it as a platform? And he was like, absolutely. I've seen your work before. I know you're fair. I know you love the character. Take Superman on film. Like that's a story that always just struck me, and, my wedding last night was another example of Superman fans being cut differently because the groom, Russell, as soon as I met him via a Zoom to plan the wedding, I knew something special was going on because as soon as he sat down in frame next to his fiance, he had a blue and he had a classic Superman hoodie on that I happen to have too. So I commented on, oh, we've got the same hoodie, and we started catching up. And, the way he described what Superman means to him, it just, it rings true to me. He said he's always meant a lot to me. Going back to my childhood, he's always been an important thing to me. And it just, like, that's the people who talk about Superman, they talk about him like he's real. They talk about him through all the different incarnations, whether it's comic books or animation or live action or, the TV show, whatever it is. People talk about him like he's this real force in their life, this force for good, this force that just gives them comfort and love and radiates warmth towards them. And I find that fascinating, right? Because again, we're talking about a superhero, a fake fictional story about an alien from another planet who flies here. Like, it couldn't be more outlandish and more far-fetched. And yet the principles and the story of Superman have affected so many lives for so many years, for so many generations. And when I met this groom, I could feel his Superman energy coming off of him. And I told him about this show, and hey, Russell, it listens now. So Russell, congrats. Last night was amazing. Handling his wedding, it brought a few tears to my eyes. Even after 21 years of handling weddings, I can still get fully caught up in the moment. And Russell gets so many brownie points because we did one thing similar. For our wedding ceremonies, we each actually gave ourselves an entrance. I don't know how many weddings you've gone to, but oftentimes the groom doesn't really get an entrance. He just kind of sneaks up on the side of the aisle and is suddenly standing over there next to the officiant. And then everyone else gets the special music and the special march down the aisle. And the groom is just there waiting for his betrothed to be brought to him. But at my wedding, I'm like, forget that. I get an entrance too. And before anyone came out, when it was time for me to come out, I had the DJ play John Ottman's version of the Superman March, the version that played in Superman Returns. Not because, it's better than John Williams or whatever, but since the Superman Returns version was a little more modern and it had a little more clarity and punch to it, that was the version I wanted to walk out to, especially because it starts with the dun-dun-dun. Dun 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 dun. I love the dun dun. I've always loved the. You know what I mean? When you hear that, Clark is about to transform into Superman. The dun dun dun. So anyway, that's how I came out for my wedding, and for his wedding, Russell came out to the John Ottman version of the Superman March. And the funny thing is, he probably thought he was going to have to explain the nuances and differences of this stuff to the DJ for his wedding. And I told him, I'm like, dude, I'm way ahead of you. I know all about the themes and why you chose the Ottman version. And I told him about the podcast and I told him about all this stuff. And right away, it was like, man, we were on the same page here. So that was really cool. But he gets brownie points because aside from just walking out to the Superman March, and he did it beautifully, by the way, because, a hush comes over the crowd as the background music comes to an end. And then we hear the dun dun dun. And right away, I heard people go, oh, we're starting, because people know the groom. People know Russell. Same thing happened at my wedding, where when we heard the music going, people instantly looked back because they knew this must mean that Mario's coming. So very similarly, the music starts and people start reacting because they know this must mean Russell's about to come down the aisle. And when they look up the aisle, he steps out and he puts his hands on his hips, a la Superman. And then his parents, who are adoptive parents, by the way, his own Jonathan and Martha, they came out and took either side of him and walked him down the aisle. It was the most beautiful Clark Kentish thing I've ever seen. And when it was time for him to read the vows, Homie took the vows from the comics that Superman gave to Lois when they got married. Okay. And he adapted it into what he had to say to her, to his beautiful wife. And it was just, He floored me. He floored me, and the love there yesterday. Everyone seemed to be a geek. Get this: during the toasts, his best man had to throw some dirt on the Snyder Cut, and he had to throw he said, and by the way, Batman versus Superman is a terrible movie. And by the way, as he's making these comments, Russell's covering his face playfully because obviously he must like those. And tables of his friends were cheering and booing the Snyder Cut and cheering for these opinions. It was just funny. I was in a room filled with people who care about the stuff that I care about. Like, I've never had that at a wedding where the geek fanboy quotient was so high that we're literally referencing the Snyder Cut at a wedding. Even in his vows, he said, listen, in March of 2021, you called out of work to watch a 4-hour extended cut of a superhero movie with me. That's one of the times I knew we were meant to be together. And honestly, the fact that she was willing to do that, Nicole, yes, you are a very special lady. If you called out of work to watch a 4-hour DC extravaganza, and that's not even necessarily your thing, I mean, it explains why the two of you have now ended up married. But yes, last night was like super special. It put so much wind in my sails. It was just, I wanted to just sit in that room for a little while longer with this beautiful couple and their beautiful friends and family who are so invested in them. It was just like being at the epicenter of love last night. So I just had to kind of shout that out. And, I also want to shout out my mother because, you see, I found out fairly recently, all things considered, that I'm actually a second generation Superman nerd. I didn't realize this. Look, I've always thought of my mom, my Ma Kent of the Upper West Side. I've always thought of her as my Superman fan friend, like my companion in all this stuff. She took me to see Superman 4 in theaters. That's when I had that religious experience of seeing Superman save the day and hearing the music and going through the whole roller coaster ride of thinking he might have died. And I was a 4-year-old boy who walked out of the Elmwood Theater that afternoon going, I love Superman. I was changed after that. And I saw that with her. And then it was her who I brought to the movies 19 years later when there was finally another Superman movie to watch. She was my +1 to see Superman Returns a couple of times. And then when Man of Steel came out, that was 7 years after that, I also took her to see that in theaters. So I've always thought of my mom as my +1, my Ma Kent, my person who helped really foster my love of Superman. But I didn't realize that her love goes back to her own childhood. I somehow didn't realize this. I thought maybe she just, she was familiar with him and she maybe watched the series, The Adventures of Superman with George Reeves. And, maybe she just liked the Reeve movies. I never really understood. I never knew that it went any deeper. But she finally revealed to me that, as a Cuban immigrant, as someone coming to this country at age 6 in the 1960s, coming to this strange, new, very foreign land, coming from a small town in Cuba to the big city of Manhattan, she said Superman was someone who brought her comfort right away. That Superman to her was like the symbol for American freedom. That he was comfort. He made her feel like, okay, this scary new place isn't that scary because this is the place that Superman defends. And she was young and she was, grasping with these huge life changes at age 6. But as soon as she came here, she latched on to the idea of Superman, the symbol for freedom and the pursuit of happiness. And so she always, she would watch the TV show. To her, it was a huge deal as a Cuban immigrant to see Superman show up on I Love Lucy, which had Ricky Ricardo, Desi Arnaz, the Cuban star at the time, who was really married to Lucille Ball at the time. Cuban Americans found that show very, very significant and important because Cuban representation was not exactly a thing in the 50s and 60s. And to have Desi Arnaz on the big screen, that was a big, important thing for our culture and for our people. And I don't know if you know this, but George Reeves, there is a crossover episode where Superman shows up as Superman. It's not George Reeves. It's literally in the world of Ricky and Lucy, Superman also exists. you know, and I know that was extraordinarily special to her. And it's just, I didn't know this until recently, that basically she has loved Superman and what he stands for, and he's brought her comfort and a feeling of safety and protection her whole life. And that's one of the reasons why she brought me to go see him in 1987. Because I already loved Superman. I already kind of had some exposure through, I think, reruns on TV and the action figures. But with the movie in theaters, we went to go see this, and especially at a sort of critical time. That was as our Krypton was exploding. Our Krypton, our home, our family was falling apart. And we were about to fly over to El Salvador and start a whole new life with my grandfather and kind of, start over again. And this was the summer right before that big scary change. And we went to go see Superman together. And, I'll never forget that. And I want to thank you, Ma. I know you're watching. I know you're listening. Thank you for passing on Superman. He's been there for you, and he's been there for me. But okay, now it is time for this week's Superman on Film update. By the way, who knows where this music is from? If you know where this music is from, I dare you to leave it in the comments. If you're a true Superman fan, you will know why I choose this as the Superman on Film news jingle. But okay, so for this week's show, I am happy to announce that, folks, the trailer is ready. That's right. Over on social media, James Gunn has let it be known that the trailer is on his hard drive. And the heavy implications that he's no longer working on it, that it is now a completed thing. And now the big question becomes, when are we going to see it? It still seems like December is the month. For a number of reasons, because not only is December when the DCU begins on December 5th, when Creature Commandos comes out. No. December's also when Superman and Lois comes to a close. And you know that, DC Studios kind of wanted to close that loop. They don't want to have multiple versions of these heroes operating at the same time. They feel like these last several years where DC has languished, it's because everything is so scattered and disconnected, and there's multiple Jokers and multiple Batman and multiple Superman and multiple Flashes. And he says, the only way we're going to create a coherent, cohesive universe that audiences are going to be able to buy into is if we make, here's the one Superman, here's the one Wonder Woman, here's, he wants to basically make the ultimate version of each hero and then have them appear across all the different mediums. So we know that Superman and Lois has to come to a close before now we can start introducing people to the new Superman. So I believe they've announced that Superman and Lois ends that first week of December, similar to how Creature Commandos comes out that first week of December. Superman and Lois will be coming out on the Monday, and then I think Thursday is the premiere date for Creature Commandos that week. So I have a feeling that the closure of Superman and Lois and the launching of the DCU in earnest with Creature Commandos is going to give us a wonderful opportunity to receive a Superman trailer. It's either going to be dropped online. Maybe they'll even premiere it with the finale of Superman and Lois. That would be interesting. I don't think they will, but that would be an interesting option, something to consider. I have a feeling that more likely than not, it is going to get attached to some big title that is releasing in theaters in December. And that's when we're going to get to see it. But we'll see. Either way, I think December is the month. And either way, it sounds like the trailer itself is ready. It's done. It's sitting in a hard drive. Now it's just figuring out when are they going to lay it on us. The other big bit of news is that, guys, a cut of the movie exists. Okay. James Gunn was asked online if he's had a chance to see a cut of the movie yet. And he responded that he's already seen it dozens of times. Dozens. All right. So that's wild, because that means that, the movie is done. Obviously there's probably still more effects that have to happen. They're going to tighten certain things. They're going to, they have to refine things here and there. But essentially, he has seen the movie over and over again already. So, like, I don't know about you, but that just gives me chills because it's like, wow, this is a real thing. You know, there's always that part of me as a long-suffering Superman fan who's had promising things mentioned and then taken away from him repeatedly. As someone like that, you know, I don't tend to believe anything good's happening until it actually happens. So again, now knowing that there's actually a cut of the movie sitting there, it's like, oh, this is really happening. This is not, you know, this is not just some fantasy that I'm hoping for. This is real life. So yeah, those are the big announcements as I see them, the big updates that the trailer's ready. The movie, he's seen it several times, so a decent cut already exists. And with that, let's dive into this week's main topic, which is James Gunn's Superman Influences, Volume 1. You see, since the inception of this project, James has mentioned many, many things that have informed his writing of this film and have informed his direction that he's going to take things in. And there are way too many things to cover in just one episode, so there will be a few volumes of these throughout the run of this show. So that's why, you know, figure it'll be like a few episodes of historic Superman on film topics, as I've done so far, followed by a volume of this little deep dive into the what's going into making this movie. So that's what this one is. We're not going to be looking retrospective today. We're going to be looking at the future and which projects James Gunn is using to create this wonderful future for the Man of Steel. Because, you know, one post that I really found interesting was towards the beginning of the project, when he was shortly after he was announced as actually directing the film and not just writing it. He was asked, you know, aside from the Christopher Reeve films, are there any other influences that you'd like to share with us? And first of all, I just want to point out, I don't think the Christopher Reeve films are going to be much of a direct influence. That's one thing I've been saying for a long time. If you're expecting this to be some kind of a rehash, if you're expecting this to feel like Superman the movie 2.0 or 3.0, if you want to consider Superman Returns also kind of a remake, I think your expectations are likely to be disappointed because I don't see James Gunn trying to ape Superman the movie. I think there may be just some inherent similarities because there are certain things that work magnificently in Superman the film that are just simply core Superman stuff. So when he does some of this core Superman stuff, it might remind you of the Reeve films, but I don't think it's him directly trying to evoke those movies. I think he's trying to evoke Superman, and those movies evoke Superman. So there will likely, you know, there will naturally be some you know, moments that strike similarly. But in this post about the things that are influencing it, he included 10 different images. And for those of you watching the show on YouTube, I'm just going to kind of cycle through them. You know, we have everything from, you know, the very first images of Superman. We have a comic with the Superman family. We have a shot from All-Star Superman. We have a shot from Superman the Animated Series. We have some Alex Ross, Justice Society, Kingdom Come looking stuff. We've got Superman for All Seasons. We've got, you know, he's, oh, that's Clark. I didn't mean to show you Clark again, although, come on. Clark Elliott Robles is the man. And also he shows the Max Fleischer Superman. So for today's purposes, we're going to focus largely on the original Superman, you know, the Siegel and Schuster version of the character, because he chose an image that evokes that. We're going to talk about All-Star Superman. We're going to talk about Superman for All Seasons. And along the way, kind of just lightly touch on Superman, the animated series. But yes, that's what this week's episode will center on, the things from those stories and those versions of Superman that I think are likely to show up in this adaptation, and the things that I find interesting and notable, and that if these are the things that are inspiring him, you know, we're in for a treat. We're in for a real big treat. So let's start with Action Comics 1. Let's start with where it all began, since that was the first image he posted. And it's interesting, too, because the image he posted of Superman breaking a chain using the muscles on his chest, that has now since already been adapted, right? He posted that image in the beginning of 2023. And eventually, when we found the opening logo, the opening crawl for DC Studios, we found that it adapted that very same image, and that image becomes the DC Studios logo. So already, it gives the impression that these references that he's been putting out there, he's not kidding. These things really are going to inform the movie. These things really are part of his creative process. Because right out of the gate, that very first image became the image for DC Studios. But the reason I love that Action Comics 1 is a big part of his influences here is when you go back to that first issue, there's something rather extraordinary about the first 3 saves we see from Superman. Because look, with Superman, it's easy to just try to tell larger than life fantastical tales, right? He's a flying alien with super strength and bullets bounce off his chest. And especially in 1938, they could have gotten away with doing a story about Superman fighting some big monster that shows up in Metropolis. It could have been some sort of far-flung, over-the-top, childish sort of scenario. But what you get in Action Comics 1 is not anything remotely childish or silly. The 3 saves in Action Comics 1, and it's actually 3.5 that he makes, but the 3.5 saves are all people who are oppressed. People who, let's go through it, okay? Save number 1, the very first recorded Superman save, is a woman who was wrongfully accused and was about to be sentenced to death. She was going to be put into the electric chair, and Superman snatched her from the prison, goes to the governor's house, fights for her innocence, and claims he knows who the real killer is. So the very first save, he's going after the justice system and the idea of a wrongfully accused person about to be put to death. Then the very next save is stopping a wife beater. The next person he tries to save is a woman who's being punched by her husband. And he bullies the husband because, like, you're not hitting a woman anymore. And, he stands up for this woman who's being abused physically by her spouse. That's save number 2. Then there's save number 3, where there's a very aggressive man who wants to be with Lois and won't take no for an answer. And he teaches that guy a lesson, but that's more like, that's like a half save. But even that, again, he's defending Lois from an overly aggressive, predatory man who will not take no for an answer. But then the final big save, the real official save 3 in the book, was exposing a corrupt politician. He goes after someone who's trying to make a senator do his bidding, and the senator has indeed been doing his bidding. Look at this. It's 1938, and Superman is trying to get corruption out of Washington and trying to deal with people who are, putting their negative influences into our laws and policies. That's how Superman began, okay? Superman, defender of the oppressed. That was his first, that was Siegel and Schuster's mission, to show him saving the little guy, to show him standing up for the people who are being abused by people in power or people who are abusing their roles in people's lives and holding it as power over others. Like, that is core Superman values. And that's why people have grown up loving Superman, because everyone has gone through dark times and we all wish he would show up and fix this injustice. We wish that we lived in a world where there was an ever-present, ever-kind, ever-helpful voice of reason to show up and go, that is not fair. What you are doing cannot continue because this is not how we treat each other. And that was the very initial message of Superman. And I freaking love that. And I also freaking love how much he seems to love All-Star Superman, because it's such a unique story. All-Star Superman is like, I don't know, if this film is really going to ape All-Star Superman in some way and give us a world that feels like the one in that book, the best way I can describe it is like, how the MCU kind of started with a sort of regular-ish story. Tony Stark's story was a fairly straightforward superhero tale of a guy who goes through a tough time, builds himself a suit, fights the guy who did this to him, saves the day. They didn't start bringing in the big, more fantastical elements until the Thor movies showed up. And really, in general, it took a while to get to the heavy level of science fiction fantasy that the MCU would eventually become known for. But imagine if the MCU had started with Black Panther. Started in a world that was already super high tech, super, forward thinking with all kinds of sci-fi lore and interesting characters and things that could never exist in real life. But in this world, we can just accept that all this stuff just exists in this reality. All-Star Superman is a lot like that. In All-Star Superman, right out of the gate, you are in a Superman world that is fully fleshed out and three-dimensional, where, yes, Superman exists. Yes, everyone knows about it, but he's not the only incredible thing on this planet. Everything is already fairly futuristic. There are labs on the moon trying to figure out crazy scientific marvels. There's monsters that show up that Superman has to just deal with, and the people of Metropolis just know that sometimes this sort of stuff happens. There's it's a world that already just accepts that all of these larger than life things exist. And it's very sort of matter of fact about it. It doesn't try to explain the lore too much. It just drops you into, here's a world where aliens exist and there are heroes and there are superpowered villains. And this is just how it is. We're not going to try to hold your hand and get you to understand how this is kind of like real life, but also kind of different. No, All-Star Superman is just, here is a heavy sci-fi fantasy story, and the characters behave in ways that we relate, and there are natural humanistic elements to it, but this is not Earth. This is a whole totally different fantasy world. And, one of the things that I find interesting about All-Star Superman and Superman for All Seasons, and even the Action Comics 1, and also even the John Byrne Superman stuff that we know has also influenced this, is that they all gloss over the origin. And we know that James Gunn is also he's going to do that. He said this is not an origin story. We are not going to be watching Krypton explode. We're not going to be doing the whole first act on Krypton thing. We're not doing that. We're just starting this story in progress. Superman exists. He's been here for a while, and here's the story. And it makes sense that he feels this way because a lot of the stories that he is into for Superman, it's literally the origin is handled in one page. In most of these adaptations, if you go and read through these things, it's always the first page is just the bullet points. Doomed planet, scientist, rocket, kindly family finds him in Smallville, Superman. It literally just listen, we all know the bullet points of this story, so we're just going to dive straight on into telling you this story of Clark Kent becoming Superman, or in the case of All-Star Superman, this story of how a Superman who's now at the end of his life is trying to figure out how he can have the most positive impact before his life is over. So the focus tends to be why he chooses to be Superman, why he does what he does, and what are the things that influenced him to be the way that he is. And when you approach Superman from this sort of philosophical lens, it makes him such an interesting character. And it adds so many levels and layers to who he is and why he does what he does. But something that in All-Star Superman just floored me is the way that they use Jonathan and Martha, and Jonathan in particular. But in both stories, in All-Star Superman and in Superman for All Seasons, they go so far out of their way, the writers do, to show that without Jonathan and Martha and his upbringing in Smallville, Clark doesn't become Superman. They make it very clear that their teachings, their way of being, that is what we owe Superman to. That the reason he didn't take over the world and become a tyrant and become evil was because of the love and the guidance that they showed him. And we all know this at a sort of fundamental level, but we haven't really seen many stories that really fully show it. In the movies, especially, in the movies, if you go back to Superman, the movie, we get a couple of great scenes with Jonathan and Martha, but it's really just these fleeting few, just couple of moments, and then they're gone and they're out of the story, and then they're not really even referenced again. And then in Man of Steel, Snyder and Nolan and Goyer, they tried to put some emphasis on how Jonathan is really concerned for Superman, for Clark, and for, he's so worried that he could get taken away from them, that he even thinks maybe he should have let the bus of kids drown, all that kind of stuff. Like, they were trying to show an interesting take on Jonathan, but ultimately, it was very polarizing. And the fact that Clark let him die in front of everyone, that was a question, that was a questionable decision in Man of Steel. And in general, you never, I don't know, to me, it never felt like Jonathan's teachings are directly responsible for who Superman is. And in All-Star Superman, the issue dedicated to Jonathan, it left me in shambles of, there were tears streaming down my face, man, because I've never seen a Jonathan do this. But in All-Star Superman, Jonathan brings Clark out to look at the starry sky there over Smallville. And he recounts to him that he and Martha had been married for close to 10 years before Clark showed up, and that they'd always wanted a child, and it had caused them all kinds of heartache and distress that they were never able to succeed in having a child. And he would come out and pray to the stars that they would send him a child one day. And then one night, the stars did. And there's the shooting star, and it's the rocket ship that came from the stars and crash landed and brought them their son. To me, that's such a sweet way to paint it. We've seen this idea of Clark and Martha as the sweet older couple that never got to have kids and now finds him. But we've never gotten this idea that Jonathan was literally praying to the stars, and the stars answered. That to me, that floored me. Reading that, I thought that was the most beautiful thing, and it gave an element of emotion and sincerity and vulnerability to Jonathan that I don't think gets shown much in different mediums. And when Jonathan dies, see, this one does use the plot device of Jonathan's death being what pushes Clark to become Superman, which, I kind of hope they're not doing. I've mentioned before, I would love it if Jonathan lives into Superman's adulthood so he could fly back to the farm and get some guidance from Ma and Pa and all that sort of stuff. Like, I think that's something that we've never seen in the movies and that I would love for them to tackle. But in All-Star Superman, they go that route. And in Clark's eulogy to Jonathan, really kind of says it all. So let me just read what he said in his eulogy. He said, "Jonathan Kent taught me that the strong have to stand up for the weak, and that bullies don't like being bullied back. He taught me that a good heart is worth more than all the money in the bank. He taught me about life and death. And he showed me by example how to be tough and how to be kind and how to dream of a better world. He taught me that a measure of a man lies not in what he says, but what he does. Those are lessons I'll never forget." I love that because if you listen to all those characteristics, he's describing Superman. So that means that Jonathan taught him to be Superman. And then the big finish for that issue that was dedicated to him was that in this version of Superman, like I said, it's very fantasy heavy. It's very sci-fi. But, if you haven't read it, Superman is dying, but at his fortress of solitude, he's been working on ways to make like a clone of himself or make future versions of himself so that there's always a guardian, a protector watching over Earth. And he uses this weird space-time portal to communicate with Supermen from the future who are all descended from him. And there's all this, this funky, weird fantasy stuff. But in this story, the short version is that a Superman from the future shows up. And he presents Clark with a flower to put on Jonathan's grave. And he says, this Superman from the future says, this is an indestructible flower from New Krypton. For him, from all of us, in remembrance of all that we are and all that we will be. The fact that all the future Supermen know that they wouldn't have existed without Jonathan's guidance of Clark, that all these Supermen give their great thanks and owe their debt of gratitude to this simple farmer from Kansas, when they are these godlike beings from Krypton, from another world. That to me just gobsmacked me. I thought it was so beautiful and so emotional, and making Jonathan so critical to who Superman is. I don't know. To me, it really speaks to me. And I love that aspect of All-Star Superman. And meanwhile, Superman for All Seasons also does a lot of heavy lifting and showing the importance of Smallville and showing the importance of the lessons he learns while growing up there. And I love the way Superman for All Seasons grounds Clark's mission on Earth. Because when it comes to why Clark becomes Superman, there have been different motivations over the years. Sometimes it's treated almost like this fate, this destiny, like Jor-El sent him here so he could be our protector. In Man of Steel, the thing that makes Clark become Superman is that Zod comes out and basically forces him out and says, either you reveal yourself, Kryptonian, or I destroy this place. So that's what ultimately makes him become Superman. In the Christopher Reeve movies, it seems almost more like a natural progression of things, where after Jonathan dies, Clark goes on this spiritual quest to figure out what to do, and he goes to the fortress, and by the end of his time at the fortress, he's decided he's going to be Superman now. It almost feels more like a matter of inevitability. But in Superman for All Seasons, there's this one very effective scene that really makes the case for why Clark makes that change in his life and becomes Earth's greatest savior. And essentially, a tornado comes and starts ripping through Smallville. And Clark helps, but he's only able to help in a limited way. Similar to the situation in Man of Steel, right? Where he can help, but since he's trying to keep the secret, he can't really do as much as he really could do because he's so worried about this darn secret. But at the end of the day, Clark does help. He gets rid of the tornado and he's able to prevent some of the damage that would have come, but there was still other damage. There was still other loss. And while Clark is trying to figure out, he's talking to his pastor about what to do. He's having this moral conundrum. Another thing that Man of Steel sort of, pulled from. He asked the question of, what if one man could have saved everyone? And the pastor's like, oh, Clark, don't be so hard on yourself. No one man could have done anything to stop all this. And he just asked, but what if one man could have saved everyone? And it shows that is why he's Superman, because he realizes I can do something about the suffering. I can do something to help many, many more people than I've been doing. I have these gifts and I can't use them to their full ability if I'm hiding who I am. And if I'm trying to protect some kind of a secret, then I can never really use these gifts for what they can really do. So the fact that it really comes down to him asking himself, what if one man could have saved everyone? That to me is so incredibly powerful, and it's so core Clark Kent Superman goodness. You know what I mean? It's so like intrinsically who the character is and why the character is. And I just, if the movie has a similar pivotal moment like that, I think that would be great. I feel like the two movies so far haven't really had that big aha moment of, oh, this is why I have to do this. They've just kind of, in a way, either glossed over it or he was forced to become Superman. So if there's a scene like that, I'm going to be all for it. And in general, looking at these different influences, there are other just widespread similarities amongst them all. Whether it's Superman for All Seasons, whether it's All-Star Superman, whether it's the animated series, all of these include a Lex Luthor who is a public figure. He's not, he's a known entity. He's not operating in the shadows. In the John Byrne ones, he's like a well-known mogul. In All-Star Superman, he's almost like some kind of mad scientist who's already in prison for doing terrible things. It's just he's a known thing, and in certain versions of these stories that James Gunn has been reading, he's also a romantic foil for Superman, which we've never really seen. That's another thing I think would be interesting. In John Byrne's Superman, Lois actually goes on dates with Lex, and she humors his attention. And it's mainly because she wants access and she wants to learn more about him, and she deep down thinks he's also quite bad, but she wants to be able to prove it. But still, it creates this interesting, dynamic where Lois and Lex have a thing, and maybe Lex is crazy about Lois, but he knows that Lois is obsessed with Superman. And that's just one of the many reasons he's jealous of Superman. But across all of these different influences, it looks like James Gunn likes a Lex that is publicly known, that is out in the world and not just a real estate mogul living underground like Gene Hackman, and not some disliked, weird, tech geek, awkward young guy, Jesse Eisenberg from BVS. He is a known, powerful entity in the world that people have very strong opinions about. Some people think he's a great man trying to help us. Some people see him for what he is, but he's not lurking in the shadows. He's Lex Luthor, a significant part of Metropolis's populace, that the people of Metropolis, they know, I appreciate the hell out of that. And I appreciate the way that the versions of Lex in these books, he's always trying to get rid of or replace Superman, since he wants to show that he's the real good guy, that he's the one that everyone should be worshiping and idolizing, and not this outsider from another planet. He invents things constantly. He makes clones of Superman that ends up backfiring. He makes a robot force of super protectors who are meant to do Superman's job, but they have none of his kindness or understanding, so it always backfires. He imbues some goon of his with an experimental, formula that turns him into a monster, and of course that ends up backfiring. I mean, the recurring pattern is Lex tries a lot and it always blows up in his face, and he always ends up suffering for it. But I do kind of like that Wile E. Coyote versus Roadrunner sort of vibe between Lex and Superman, where he's constantly using this incredible intellect he has to try and stop or at least make people doubt Superman, and it never works. But there was something heavy in Superman for All Seasons where Lex seems to understand, okay, I can't really hurt him. He's bulletproof. He's super powerful. Everything we throw at him, he just fights. But I can hurt his heart. If I could make him question himself, if I could make him wonder whether or not he's doing the right thing, then I could win. And in Superman for All Seasons, he creates this situation where there's this toxin that is being emitted out into all throughout Metropolis, and people are dropping like flies. And Superman goes to Lex because he knows he's behind it, but Lex claims he's not, and he's actually got this woman here, this powered being named Toxin, who she has the antidote. So if you take her out there and spray this gas antidote all over Metropolis, I told you these stories are very heavily sci-fi. All right, they're very, this ain't real life. But anyway, Lex is like, if you fly around over the city with Toxin, she will dump the gas antidote and it will cure everyone. You will save everyone. Go. So Superman, without even thinking twice, grabs Toxin and flies around, and she releases the gas and they save the city. But Toxin dies. Because since she was exposed and she got rid of the antidote, there was none to save her. And her exposure while being in his arms to this toxin, she dies. And even though he just helped save all the people of Metropolis, the fact that she died while he was trying to do the right thing, it shakes him at his core, and he disappears. He goes back to Smallville for a while and almost questions whether or not he should be Superman anymore, because he felt like he was fooled by Lex and someone is dead now because of it, and he doesn't know what to do. Once again, he's questioning his place in the world. And by the end of the book, the people of Smallville and events there, the morals and lessons that have been instilled upon him, they lead to him once again donning the suit, returning to Metropolis with clarity on the mission. But it's an interesting thing where Lex eventually does realize, okay, if I can't physically hurt him, but I could hurt him in here. If I can make him doubt himself and question himself, that'll be a way to get rid of Superman. So these are all things that I think are going to end up being part of this story. And I hope you've enjoyed this sort of deep dive into some of the influences that James Gunn has referenced. I think he's reading and has read some of the most interesting Superman stories that exist. And I love that he's letting this influence his stories. Because, as I've said before, none of Superman on film has been particularly comic booky up until very recently. Superman the movie was based on a novel by Mario Puzo, who seemed to just take the bullet points of what he thought was cool from the comics and then create his own real kind of version of the story. They weren't directly trying to adapt any of the seminal books or anything. They were just, it was a Hollywood screenwriter trying to adapt a comic book IP to make some money and start a film franchise, but it wasn't necessarily trying to adapt the books. And then with Man of Steel, while there were certainly a few visual references, there's the scene between Clark and Jonathan is right out of Secret Origin. The scene between the pastor and the tornado, that is a sort of nod to Superman for All Seasons. Zack Snyder definitely got the visuals right, the iconography right. But if you look at the actual story of Man of Steel, its most direct influence, its most direct reference are the first two Reeve movies, where once again, we're making it seem like General Zod is integral to the origin, which even though, he wasn't even invented until 13 years after Superman was created, and he was never part of the original origin until the Donner movies made it so. Man of Steel basically was like, let's take the stories of Superman 1 and 2 and condense it into one situation. And just like those movies, we're going to start with an Act 1 on Krypton with Zod, vowing revenge on Jor-El and his heirs. And, Man of Steel really, for whatever reason, chose to sort of paraphrase another Hollywood movie, instead of trying to adapt the lore in a new and exciting way and give us villains and a way to see Superman that we've never looked at before. It was just, here's what you've seen already, but with a drastically different tone. So that's why to have a movie on the way that seems to embrace the 86 years of Superman stories that exist, that seems to want to show us a version of his world, of his supporting cast. That's another thing too. all these stories that I'm talking about today, they all have a hugely vibrant supporting cast. You know, when he's in Smallville, he's got Jonathan, Martha, Lana, Pete Ross, and there's other key members of the Smallville community who are intrinsic to who he is. They're part of Clark's life and his worldview. And in Metropolis, the Daily Planet has its full gallery of supporting stars. You've got Lois, but you've also got Perry, and you've also got Jimmy, and you've got Steve, and you've got Cat Grant, and you've got Ron Troop. Like, you've got, Superman's supporting players have never been given much shine. You know what I mean? Like, it's always been him and Lois, and Perry gets a few moments to chew the scenery. And in the original movies, Jimmy Olsen got a little bit of screen time. But like, in general, we've never really opened up the world to look at all of the supporting players, all the people who make Clark Clark and therefore make Superman Superman, and all the different ways that they affect him and impact him and affect the stories and the way they react the way they treat Clark and how it's different from how they treat Superman. Like, it's such a fun dynamic, and the movies haven't really done it. The movies focus largely on Clark Superman, on Lois, and on the villains. We rarely get to see Superman's expanded world. So that's another reason why, as I'm looking at the influences of James Gunn, I'm very, very heartened. I'm very, very, I'm just convinced that we are about to see a Superman story, the likes of which we've never seen before. And we're very lucky for it. And I'm very glad James Gunn has done all this research that he's done, and that he's essentially honoring generations and generations of creators. Because these stories, I mean, Action Comics 1 is 1938. Superman for All Seasons, I think, came out in the last 15 years. No, that was All-Star Superman. Like, all this stuff, like, it ranges. It's not just like he's looking at one period of Superman. He's looking at all these different eras and synthesizing the core values of the character to tell us a story that is full of his hope, his ideology, his kindness, his strength, but it gives us the full picture at last. So I've just, that just about does it for this episode. Thanks for waiting as long as you did for episode 13 of the Superman on Film podcast. If you ever have a question, if you'd ever like to suggest a topic, you could shoot me an email. This is a brand new feature. You could shoot me an email at supermanonfilm@gmail.com. You shoot me an email there, and I'll be happy to tackle your topic or question on a future episode. And, if you haven't yet, please like, rate, review, subscribe. Leaving reviews always helps, and I always read new reviews here on the show. So thank you for those who've kept the reviews coming. Thank you for those who, even though I've been gone for close to a month, Superman on Film is always still charting at the top of the Superman podcasts on Apple Podcasts. So thank you for those who've kept me in the loop. I hear some of you have done some re-listens or re-watches of the show while waiting for me to come back, and that just floors me. But thank you for those who've enjoyed the first 12 episodes. I'm going to do my very best to not let any more big breaks come. I think I'm going to have the control and the time to do that now. I may even try to do 2 episodes this coming week. We'll see. Because, there's a lot to talk about. And honestly, talking Superman right now these days is amongst the happiest things going on for me. So until next time, life is chaos. Be kind. Up, up and away.